I got a secret that the restaurants don't want me to tell you, and that's their boneless short rib special. It's not short rib, it's chuck. Chuck is a fraction of the price of short rib, and if you cut it well and treat it nice, it tastes and looks exactly the same. So in this video, I'm gonna show you a boneless short rib recipe complete with a creamy polenta and a beautiful mushroom sauce that will rival anything that you'll get in the restaurants. For the full ingredient list, check the description box below, but enough talking, let's get cooking. So let's start off with this boneless chuck roast. So this is just a big chuck roast. It's pretty cheap as far as beef goes and way cheaper than any short rib. Let me show you how I trim it up so it looks exactly like some boneless short rib that you would get in a restaurant. So before I cut it up, let me show you the piece that I chose. So this is a really nice thick piece. It's probably only like 2 inches thick, and it's got some really large sections that are really well marbled. Like, look how nice like the marbling looks here. Once we get rid of these big fat lines and cut it into pieces, you're gonna think it is boneless short rib. This chuck is just gonna split really easily just by getting my fingers in there and pulling it apart. I don't even need a knife for this part. And once I split this fat line, then I can start taking my knife and cutting through. But let the fat guide you as to where to cut. So let's work this section first. So here is going to be one nice section that we're going to part out. You can see how easily with this really sharp knife, you can just drag it and the meat separates right from that fat. Look at this, I'm not even touching it with the knife and it's just coming right apart. This is going to take a little bit of time, but this is going to save you money. So it's either money or time, you choose. So usually I like to get it into big chunks first, and then I'll figure out how I'm gonna cut it into individual pieces. Now let's take this fat off of here. So now that we took off most of those big fat lines, we're gonna take this and we'll cut it into nice cubes. And now look at this really nice marbling that we got through here. This is one of the nicest parts about chuck, is how well marbled it is. But if you looked at this, I mean, this is almost identical to what short rib would look like. And if I see that I can remove any large chunks of fat, that probably won't render. I'm gonna go ahead and do that, but never at the expense of removing too much meat. Oh, actually looks pretty good. From this one chuck, we got all of these really nice pieces that once they cook down, these are gonna look really nice and are gonna really mimic what you're gonna get in a boneless short rib. When you're figuring out where to cut, you gotta kind of use your imagination and you gotta kind of see, well, what do I see? What can I remove? Like when I'm looking at the back of this, I probably see all this stuff on the outside over here. We're gonna trim that all off. That's a decent chunk right there. I probably want to get some of this fat out of there too, which probably means that this could be one piece by itself right there. And cut this into 2 large chunks. And if you don't have a sharp knife, this is going to be really hard. So check out my knife sharpening video where I show you my new favorite knife sharpener. Absolutely love it. It keeps the knife super sharp. I did it right before this video. So anytime you see any of this like silver skin here, this is not going to render really well. It's always going to be a little chewy. Try to remove as much of that stuff as possible. The thicker fat lines, those will render, but stuff like this connective tissue, it's not going to render. Try to remove as much of it as possible while trying to keep that short rib square boxy shape as best as you can. Again, once you make short rib, it's all going to crumble into nice tender pieces. So the shape of it's really just for the presentation. So now you can see we got a decent amount of some really nice cuts here. Now we're gonna season this with salt and pepper, let it sit for a little bit before we get this on the stove to sear it. Now I'm gonna season pretty liberally with some salt and some pepper, and we're gonna do both sides of these. So nice and high, sprinkle that salt on, make sure it's getting all over the outside of these. You can't get the seasoning on the inside, so make sure you're seasoning the outside enough. You're more likely to under season it than you are to over season it. And when you're getting this stuff at restaurants, it's over seasoned a heck. Now some fresh ground black pepper. Now we're gonna flip these over and we'll do the same thing on the other side. So while we're letting the seasoning do its thing on the outside of the meat, let's start prepping some of our vegetables before we head over to the stove. So now let's coarsely chop these vegetables, because none of these vegetables are actually making it on the plate. They're just in there as aromatics to season the liquid that the short rib, or really this chuck, is braising in. Let me show you how I cut those up into nice big chunks, nice and fast. Oh man, those shallots really get my eyes. Even though this is not going into the finished dish, I still like to trim off the woody root end of the garlic. So I'm just gonna cut those off, each one of these peeled garlic cloves. And now I'm just gonna crush each one of them, and that'll be it for the prep on these vegetables. Now the last component for our aromatics are gonna be some fresh herbs. So I got some sage and some thyme and some rosemary. I'm gonna take them, I'm gonna bundle them up with some of this twine, just so it's gonna be really easy to pull this out after we're done cooking. Nothing special here. We're just gonna take these, we're gonna push them all together. I'm gonna tie a loop on one end. I'm gonna wrap it around the herbs. The string goes through. And I like to leave this little string right here, because now we're going to wrap it all around. We're gonna go up and then down, and then just take the two ends and tie them together. Really simple. And we don't have to undo the knot, so we're just gonna go old double knot. So this is basically all the prep done for this recipe. So let's head over to the stove. We're gonna braise these short ribs and then start to make our liquid with these aromatics. So now I'm gonna preheat this oven to 325. And that'll be our braising temperature. So when this Dutch oven goes inside the oven. So we're gonna be cooking inside this Dutch oven, which is just a really high rimmed, thick cast iron pot. I absolutely love using the Dutch oven to make this short rib or chuck recipe. You can use any high rimmed pan, because you're gonna want enough depth in the pan that you can get sauce, and the Dutch oven gives you a nice large surface area to do the browning of the meat, and we could probably do that in 1 to 2 batches. This is probably enough meat for 2 batches for sure. So now I'm gonna put in a little oil to cover the bottom of the pan. And once I cover the bottom of the pan, we can start to add our meat. And you better hope you get that sizzle sound as soon as it hits. And remember, this doesn't have to fully cook. We're just trying to get a nice sear on the outside. So let's take a look at how some of these pieces look. So once we get this nice golden brown crust on there, that's exactly what we're looking for. And we're trying to get this on a couple of sides, so we may flip these around, maybe like 2 to 3 sides of the meat. We'll try to get this sear on. This is a really important step. Please don't rush this. And you really want to take your time with this browning process. So if you can take a look at this piece, we got beautiful color on basically like all sides of it. So once this braises, the flavor on this piece is going to be unbelievable because of all this browning that we have on the outside. So now let's take these out and we'll go round 2 on our second batch. And there is plenty of fat already in here, so these pieces can go right in, no additional oil needed. These smaller, less desirable cuts aren't going to have as much surface area. We're just going to brown them maybe on like 2 sides and they'll probably be done. But I'm trying to render as much of the fat as possible because a rendered crispy fat that's going to go inside that braising liquid is going to get super delicious and soft. So now we're gonna drop the heat down a little bit. We got all this really nice fat and this brown fond that's all burnt on the bottom. That is flavor that we are going to reclaim right now. So in goes our shallots, our celery, the carrots. We're also gonna switch tools. We're gonna go to this flat spatula, or wooden spatula, and that's gonna help scrape the bottom. But first we're just gonna let some of these aromatics release their moisture, and that's gonna start the process of reclaiming some of this wonderful flavor. And we don't need to go crazy here, just let these cook for a minute or two. Here I'll start to loosen up some of that bottom. I know you can't smell it, but it smells really good in here. Once those have had a minute or two, we're gonna throw in our garlic. Always trying to clean that bottom up and loosen up those chunks that are gonna go into our braising liquid. You can't buy that flavor. So once those have had a chance to cook and before this garlic burns, let's start to add some liquid. We're gonna start off with some red wine. So here's some cheap but drinkable red wine that I'm gonna throw in there. So nothing pricey, and it's just left over from Thanksgiving. Probably about 1.5 cups, 2 cups. And once that liquid goes in there, we're gonna wanna reduce this wine and get the alcohol out. While we're working it, we're cleaning up the bottom of the pan. And while this wine is reducing, I'm scraping up the bottom of the pan and incorporating all that fond on the bottom, those little burnt bits, into this liquid. And they're just gonna dissolve right in. Now that that wine is up to temp and has reduced a little bit, we're gonna take some beef broth, probably about an equal amount. We're gonna throw that in there. We want the liquid to be high enough so that when we put the short rib back in, that they're almost fully submerged. So we can always add a little bit more beef broth after, but I'm trying to visualize how much liquid that I would need to cover up. It's all gonna be dependent upon how big your pot is. So use your best judgment when looking at the measurements in the description box. We're gonna add some Worcester sauce and a little bit of this beef bouillon paste to bump up that umami beef flavor. We're also gonna put in a few tablespoons of some tomato paste. So now I'm really gonna work the bottom of this pan. I can't see it, but I'm gonna make sure that I scrape up all that fond that we got when we seared the meat, and that's where the best flavor of this dish comes from. So now that this has come up to a nice boil, it's reduced a little bit, we're gonna add our last couple things. So we're gonna add some dried bay leaves, our herb bundle that we made before, and then we're gonna put in one of these marrow bones to get some of that marrow flavor in there. Anytime I tell people about this, they tell me that the bones make the flavor. So let's take this super cheap bone and throw it in there along with the meat. So I'm just gonna tuck this right in. So now let's return our meat back into the pot. And if I have to add any liquid, I will by adding just a little bit more beef broth. And just like a good hot tub, there's always room for one more. We just gotta find a spot for it, and everything looks pretty good here. And we are still fully enforcing our no flavors left behind policy. So any juice that collected, we're just gonna dump that right back into that liquid. So now that all our components are in there, we're gonna give this a cover, and we're gonna send this in the oven for about 1.5 to 2 hours. So now to this high rim saute pan, I'm gonna make a polenta. I like to use a large bottom pan so I can whisk and I can get all the way to the bottom of it and around it. And we're gonna put 4 cups of water in there. And then we're gonna put 4 cups of milk. And this is gonna be the base of our liquid. So we're gonna use this combo water milk. So I got 8 cups of liquid in here, and the classic ratio of liquid to cornmeal for polenta is a 1 to 4. So 1 cup of cornmeal to 4 cups of liquid. So to this, we're gonna add our cornmeal. We're gonna get this up to a boil before we start adding the cornmeal. So once this is up to a boil, we're gonna add our cornmeal. So here we got 4 cups of cornmeal. So this is 2 cups of yellow and 2 cups of white. I like to combine them because it gives me this really nice like like pale yellow color that I love for polenta. Looks kind of similar to like the color of a mashed Russian potato. So I'm just gonna put this in a little bit at a time, and I'm just whisking in there to make sure that we're not getting any lumps. And I'm just gonna dump that in there a little bit at a time. And we're going to reduce the heat down to low to avoid any splattering. And once I get this all nice and whisked in, you can see it's going to start to take on this nice creamy consistency. We're going to take a teaspoon or two of salt, and we're going to put that in there. So now that we've got this nice and creamy, I'm going to put the lid on and let this simmer. I might reduce this to a different burner because this doesn't seem to be getting low enough, so I might put it on this back burner and put it on low for about 20 minutes. Periodically, as this is cooking, I'm gonna give this a nice stir just to make sure we're keeping everything nice and creamy. Nothing's getting burned, but every few minutes or so, I'll take the lid off and I'll give this a little stir. So after about 20 minutes, we're gonna take the polenta off the heat. It's still super hot, and so now we're gonna wanna incorporate our butter. So I got a couple of tablespoons of butter here, and that's just gonna melt once it hits the heat. And I personally like this consistency. If you want it a little runnier, add a little bit more liquid, but I think that this is gonna be the perfect consistency for the soft polenta that we're gonna use for these mock short ribs. Once that butter's mixed in, we're just gonna cover the top of this with some shredded Parmigiano Reggiano cheese. And I don't know how much I'm gonna put in here, but what I usually like to do is just cover the top of this pan with cheese. And then if we wanna add a little more, we always can. And we're also gonna season with a little fresh ground black pepper. Not a lot, just a little. So now before we call this done, let's just give this just a little taste to see if we need any adjustments. That is absolutely wonderful. So we're gonna cover this, and we're gonna keep this aside, and now let's get to our mushrooms. So now I'm gonna take these mushrooms and I'm gonna slice them up pretty thinly, and these are gonna get sauteed and get incorporated into our beautiful sauce from our mock short ribs. So now to this pan, I'm gonna add a little bit of olive oil and our mushrooms. And we're just gonna go for a nice brown on these. So first we're gonna just toss them in the oil. And after we saute these are gonna go inside the sauce. There's just gonna be a really nice vegetable element to this dish. Those mock short ribs, the polenta, and then these mushrooms with the sauce. Total complete dish. Mushrooms absorb a little bit of oil, so if anytime I think this pan is dry, I'm just gonna splash in just a little bit more oil. Once these mushrooms have softened up a little bit and they've taken on a little bit of color, we're just going to season with a little salt and some fresh ground black pepper. Mushrooms are absolutely delicious, probably some of the tastiest plant things out there, and they do not need much, just like good beef. These mushrooms are all done, so what we're gonna do is we're just gonna shut the heat off, but we're gonna leave them in the pan because this is where we're gonna finish our sauce. So these short ribs have been in the oven for a little over 2 hours. They are perfectly tender right now, so now let's remove the short rib and then take all this liquid in here and make a nice sauce. So now carefully, I'm gonna take out each of these pieces. And the color on them looks absolutely delicious. So if you look at how beautiful this is, it's not completely falling apart. I don't like my short rib falling apart where it's like absolute mush. It should be able to break with a fork, but it should have some type of meat consistency to it. As you can see, all the marrow is completely incorporated into this wonderful sauce. We're gonna take out our herb bundle. So now let's take this and dump out this liquid. You can see that bottom is completely cleaned, so we took up all that nice flavor. And now while this is settling and the fat is rising to the top, we're gonna take our fork and we're just gonna smush up any of these carrots and celery and the shallots that we put in there and reclaim as much of this flavor as possible. This is all the good stuff. And now look at all this wonderful flavor that's collecting on the bottom of this sieve. I'm gonna scrape up all that, and I'm gonna keep mushing this around until it turns into like a nice dry consistency, and we've got all the flavors and liquid out of there. So now this has had enough time to settle, and we're just gonna take this nice wide spoon and remove as much of the fat as we can off the top so this sauce isn't too greasy. And all I'm doing is just dipping the spoon in there. The fat rises to the top, and I'm trying to get as little of the other stuff in there as possible. Now that we've skimmed off most of the fat, let's take this sauce, we'll mix it up with the mushrooms on the stove. Now that this pan has heated back up a little bit, I'm gonna add our sauce. Whoa. And we're gonna cook this with the mushrooms until this reduces down just a little bit. In this wide pan, this will only take a few minutes. So this has been reduced down a little bit. I'm just gonna give it a little taste, see if we need to add any salt. Just maybe just a pinch of salt and a little bit of pepper here. And this sauce is good to go. Now let's plate this amazing dish. So first we're gonna put some of our polenta. This should have the consistency of like mashed potatoes. So now a couple pieces of the short rib. Really, it's chuck. I keep calling it short rib because it looks like short rib and I think it is. And now our mushrooms with our sauce right on the top. And to finish this dish, little chopped parsley. And here's your boneless short rib. This looks absolutely unbelievable. If this dropped down at a restaurant in front of me, I would be so excited for this special. So if we take some of this short rib, let's see if it pulls apart nice and tender. So even with just a fork and a spoon, you can see that this thing shreds absolutely beautifully. And come on, like if you saw this, would you think it's not short rib if I told you it was? Absolutely unbelievable. Let's get a little bit of everything on this bite. So a little bit of the meat, a little bit of the mushrooms. Come on, this is too good and I can't believe this. This is chuck. This is the cheapest beef you possibly can buy, and it tastes absolutely unbelievable. And again, watch how easily these pieces shred. And all that needed was a little time and attention, and this is all super duper delicious and tender. The polenta soaks up all that sauce. Super duper tender, delicious short rib. I can't stop eating this. This is so delicious. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. And if you want to check out another full meal video, check out my seared ahi tuna video. That's a really nice gourmet restaurant style meal that you can make at home for the fraction of price you can get at a restaurant. I'll see you there.